just plugged it. That's good. Before we get into the lesson proper, I just wanted to ask if there was any questions related to because I was going to, obviously I knew that this was not going to happen, but I was going to do a Q&A at the end of the sermon last week, knowing that I would, use up all my time. So if anybody has any questions about the LGBTQ2 plus thing, you can ask me right now. Plus means that it's just anything else that is encompassed under that spectrum of, I would say, sexual immorality. Yeah, there's just the moral climate has just reached such a point of given over to a depraved mind that we should not be surprised by anything that's in the news now, because it just has left, they have opened the door and it is just wide open to anything that anybody wants to come up with. If you've seen the pictures of the teacher from Ontario, that was just, not that long ago, people would be absolutely flabbergasted to see something like that happening in a high school and the teacher not get fired. In case you're wondering, the teacher came to school dressed as a woman, and not just as a woman, but in a bizarre, extreme, exaggerated outfit that was just pornographically offensive. And you would just assume that somebody at that school would have gone, okay, you're going home and there's going to be disciplinary action. But there wasn't. That's not what happened. He just came in and was there for the day. So, that's the level of depravity that our society has sunk to. So that's the level that we've reached. That's the depravity that we've reached. Where if somebody comes and shares the gospel as a teacher, that is a problem for the school board, and they'll get into trouble. But if they come dressed like that, oh, that's okay. He's protected under our law, and that's insane. But anyways, no, because as we know, the popular media, for the most part, is on the side of the LGBTQ2 plus movement, and so they are going to side with, and their reporting is slanted. And if you want to do some interesting stuff, you go on, and there is an ethics in journalism. There's a couple of different organizations dedicated to ethics in journalism. If you go on there and you actually look at the ethical standards for journalism, and then you match that up with what's actually going on in the media amongst journalists, you quickly realize that if they don't actually ignore that, and I'm saying that there are some good journalists still out there, but there is a lot of skirting around or finding loopholes in those ethical standards by which they can push their own agenda. And you will quickly discover that that is the case. I've done that. It's an interesting thing, not surprising at all. If you have looked at Francis Schaeffer's work on journalism and his critique of journalism, you'll realize that he puts forward how the media can present their own agenda by slanting the story. Oh yeah, that was quite a while ago. I think wasn't he in the? I think that the video was put out in the 80s. I'm not sure about that. Anyways, so questions? What's that? The two spirits. That is the native slant on the LGBTQ2 plus community, right? It means two spirits, which means that a man can have, or a woman can have, both a man spirit and a woman spirit. Okay, we're going to move along to John chapter 6. Now, if you remember, last we talked about the healing of the man by the pool in Bethesda, and that miracle launched a dialogue between Jesus and the Jews, and he talked about where his authority came from, and the fact that in the future he would be the judge, that the Father has entrusted judgment unto the Son. He also talked about the fact that he would speak and the dead would be raised, and we talked a little about that. That was actually, even though it almost appears that he's talking about the same thing, it was actually split. One was an immediate, that the dead are raised to life right now, and one was in the future when the dead would be raised to life for judgment. You ringing a bell? Good. Anyways, so that's what he was talking about. Okay, and now we're going to look at John chapter 6, verses 1 to 14. Actually, it should have been 1 to 15. I don't know why I didn't print off the other one. I'll just look it up in my Bible. So we're going to... What's that?
Do you permit women to ask questions in your Sunday school class?
We'll talk about that afterwards, young lady. Ask your husband.
That's why I asked you.
Anyways, sorry, that was a conversation last weekend at the lunch table. Anybody who wants to know the answer to that question will have to ask me after. Okay, so we're going to look at John chapter 6, 1 to 15. And I am looking for my glasses because I'm blind. Here we go. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed those to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Okay, so there is a time lapse between this and the previous miracle at Bethesda. And, well, actually, he was actually at the temple at the end of that story. And it's indeterminate. We don't know how long it was between those two periods. But when we get to this story, this is one of the narratives that anchors John's gospel with the synoptics. This is the only miracle that appears in all 4 gospels. It's the only one. There's lots of overlap between the Gospels, but this is the only one that appears in all 4 of the Gospels. Even when we look at the walking on the water, it only appears in 3. but this one appears in all 4. So obviously it's of tremendous significance because it's repeated. For the Holy Spirit sees fit that it be repeated 4 times. Now, when we look at this miracle in John's Gospel, and we realize that it's been included in all 4 of the Gospels, what should we be looking for? What is the purpose of the Gospel of John? Right, and by believing, we should have life in his name. Okay, so John is going to give his particular slant, his particular perspective to this miracle, which is important. And because he is already familiar with the fact that people are familiar with the other synoptic gospels. So it is unlike him to relate information to you in his gospel in repetition. He has a purpose, a plan for writing his gospel, which relates to the synoptics, but he wants to give you a perspective that the synoptic gospels don't give, right? And so when we look at this, we should be looking at how his plan for his gospel is going to relate to that. Some other things. So we see that Jesus went away to the side of the Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Tiberias. Now, that gives us a clue to a couple of things. One, it gives us a clue to when the gospel was written and to whom the gospel was written. And the reason why we know that is because the Sea of Tiberias the Sea of Galilee was not called the Sea of Tiberias till much later, right? So the people that John is writing to are going to be familiar with this body of water as referred to as the Sea of Tiberias rather than the Sea of Galilee, right? Which would mean that he's not talking to local Jews so much as he's talking to the Greeks. But we've already looked at that. The Sea of Tiberias, we looked at the timeline that he gives is in Roman time, and he gives explanations about, he points to the Passover as being the feast of the Jews, right? So he is definitely not talking to a Jewish audience, obviously. He's talking to a Gentile audience. So he gives us that it's the Sea of Tiberias, which is the Sea of Galilee. He talks about the fact that it's in Passover. Now, when we look at the other synoptic gospels, there's a timeline here that's very important that we need to understand. One, we've already talked about the fact that it was Passover. What happened at Passover in Palestine? Other than the obvious that it's the celebration of Passover. I'm looking beyond that. Right. It is a time of mass influx of people from all over the Roman Empire who are faithful, remember, faithful Jews that would be following the command of the Old Testament to come to Jerusalem, all the men at least, to celebrate the Passover, right? That was extremely important. And so there's going to be this huge influx of people into Jerusalem and into Palestine. And so you're going to get a whole bunch of people coming in, and because Jesus is performing miracles, teaching, and such, then those people are going to go out from Palestine, obviously, out into all the world. So that's it's effective for his ministry. Okay, there is a couple of things that are happening at this time that are important to remember when you look at the synoptics. The synoptics tell us a few things. One, the 12 apostles have already been sent out by Christ. So they were sent out by Christ, to give us some context, in order to preach and teach and perform miracles, right? You remember the whole story that he gave them authority to cast out demons and to heal. He told them not to take any provisions with them, that they're just to go, and they're supposed to basically live off of charity, right? Off of the support of the people around them. And so they go out, and at this time also, John the Baptist is executed, which I think is a little bit risky on the type. Obviously, Herod did not plan this. Herodias orchestrated this. And so he's executed just prior to Passover, which if Herod was going to execute him, probably would have been his first choice of timing, given that the Jews felt that John was a prophet. So the 12 go out, John the Baptist is executed, and that information comes to Jesus, right? And so Jesus has been informed that John the Baptist is dead. Jesus has been healing the sick, and then the 12 come back, and he receives their report of all that has been done, and then he says, as we hear in the synoptics, he says, okay, it's time for a break. Let's go off by ourselves, right? Because he's been working hard, and the apostles, specifically, the apostles have been working hard, and he takes them to a deserted place so that they can have a break. And when they go off to the deserted place to have a break, then the crowds follow them. And the crowds arrive, and Jesus has compassion on them because they appear as sheep without a shepherd. And he heals their sick and teaches them again. What exactly is the message, and I say exactly, what is the message that Jesus and the apostles are giving to the crowds? What does he send them out to teach?
The good news.
What's that? The good news. And what specifically is the good news that is mentioned in the synoptics? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That is the message. It is a message of repentance, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is, and along with that, see, that's the theme that they're teaching, but the specifics go well beyond that, right? The specifics are he talks about all sorts of things in terms of the Sermon on the Mount, right? And basically the teaching is that this is the standard for entrance into the kingdom of heaven, and that standard is an impossibility, right? And this is one of the things that John is focused on in his gospel, is that there is no possibility by your own righteousness to achieve salvation. It's not possible. You are to be holy as God is holy. And that should immediately make anybody who gives that any thought say, it is impossible for me as a fallen person to be holy as God is holy and to be righteous as he is righteous. It's just not possible. And so Christ's ministry is to demonstrate that that is an impossibility, and that this repentance and faith are absolutely necessary for salvation. Oh dear. Okay. Well, we'll talk to him later too. Okay, so Jesus, they're on the mountain with the apostles. The people show up, and they work all day long in ministering to the needs of the people, right? And they are healing and teaching all day long. Why were they there in the first place? They're there to get a rest. Do they get a rest? No. The people show up, and immediately they have to launch into ministry all over again. And they minister all day long. And then, when it's time for supper, what happens? Well, when you put the synoptics together with John, you realize that the disciples come to Jesus and they say, we should send all these people away so that they can get something to eat. And Jesus said, where are we going to buy bread for so many people? And he asked specifically to Philip. Why does he ask specifically to Philip? What's that? I still didn't hear you. Because Philip is from Bethsaida? That's a good guess, I guess. I have no idea. You thought I was leading somewhere with that? I am not. There is nothing in the context and nothing in the synoptics that would give any indication of why he asked Philip. But he does single out Philip specifically. Now, Philip plays a prominent role in John's gospel. Where do we first see Philip? What's that? Who? Right, that's exactly it. At the start, Philip goes and gets Nathanael, right? Nathanael's sitting under the tree, and Philip goes and says, hey, we think we found the Messiah. And nothing good comes out of that. So we see Philip there. We see Philip here, and Jesus singles him out and asks him specifically, where are we going to buy so much bread? We know that Judas took care of the purse strings, right? Because we're informed that in another passage. And we know that, so Philip wasn't obviously in charge of the financing. So we really don't know what Philip was in charge of. There is no reason given why he's to do this. The next time we see Philip is with Andrew again, and you'll see Andrew also plays prominent in John's gospel. Philip goes to Andrew and says, there's a bunch of Greeks want to talk to Jesus about salvation, and Andrew goes to Jesus about the Greeks. And at the last, we see Philip at the Passover saying, or at the Last Supper saying, show us the Father, and that will be sufficient. So we see that Philip shows up quite a bit in John's gospel, but there's no explanation given why. Why does Jesus ask him according to this text, according to this narrative? There's no reason why it's Philip specifically as far as we can see from the broader context, but there is a reason given specifically in the text itself, and that is to test him. Right. This he was saying to test him. And one of the things that we see in Jesus' ministry, he caters his ministry to individuals, right? That's kind of an important thing, is that Jesus deals with us all on an individual basis. We understand that the testing of your faith, according to James, produces perseverance, right? And we see that the testing from 1 Peter is that the testing of your faith also gives evidence of its genuineness, right? So Jesus is particularly dealing with Philip in this instance in order to test his faith and in order to purify him. Why Philip, we're not sure. What it was about Philip that required this, we don't have the evidence for. We just know that Jesus knew Philip, and Jesus knew Philip very intimately, and so he was speaking to Philip, and this was a particular instance where he was growing him. And he does that with all of us. He deals with each individual sheep according to their bent, according to their needs, according to my need, according to your need. And Jesus caters to us in testing us. Okay, so when we look at the synoptics, we see that Jesus asked this question knowing what he's already going to do. He already has a plan for the miracle, and he asked Philip, how much, where can we get bread for this? And Philip says, listen, we ain't got enough money, right? In the synoptics, he sends out the disciples to go into the crowd and see what sort of resources the crowd has. So they go out into the crowd and see if anybody's got some food, and what do they discover? 5 loaves, one boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish amongst possibly 20,000 people. Yeah, that's right. It was gluten-free bread, probably. What's that? It was barley bread. It does say that. So it's barley bread. And so it's a little bit of fish and some barley bread amongst 20,000 people isn't going to go far. So the point of this exercise would be what? That when you take stock of the resources, you would be without hope. There is no possibility that the resources are sufficient to meet the need that is there. So it has to be faith. It has to be a miracle. It's not like Jesus performed this miracle and people secretly had brought packed lunches and it wasn't really a miracle. They went out and looked amongst the crowd, and all they found was 5 loaves and 2 fishes. That's it. And they didn't have money. They were in a desolate place. There were no stores around, and they didn't even have enough money for 20,000 people to eat and have even just a little bit. So that was the case. We remember, and we'll see later on, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, Jesus makes sure that he stays in place an extra amount of time so that there's no question the guy is dead. So when the miracle happens, he stinketh. So when the miracle happens, there's no question of the miracle. It is definitely an act of miraculous power on the part of Christ. Okay, so then we see Jesus says, have the people sit down now. There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number of about 5,000. Now, he sits them down. This gives you an indication that this is an eyewitness testimony because John's giving details of the place, right? He's saying, one, he says the mountain as if he just knows what mountain it is. Then he says that there was a lot of grass in that specific area when he had all the people sit down, which would give the indication that he knew what was in the area, and he knew what was in the area at that specifically time of the year. So he was an eyewitness testimony of what went on. Okay, have the people sit down now. There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And then Jesus then took the loaves, and given thanks, he distributed those to who were seated. Likewise, also of the fish, as much as they wanted. Okay, and then he says, when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost. Okay, there's something that you should be thinking about in application of this text that's very important. The people, the crowds have shown up. The disciples and Christ are tired from ministry. They are tired from ministry. Then the crowd show up and they minister to them all day long. Healing and teaching all day long. And if you've ever taught, you know it's pretty exhausting. Then it's supper time. No doubt they're hungry. They're tired. Jesus is mourning over the death of John the Baptist. And then what do? They bust tables to 20,000 people. Imagine what that would be like. So you're tired, you're hungry, you're exhausted, ministry work has gone on and on and on and on and on and on, and then you bust tables for 20,000 people. And then afterwards, you do the cleanup. Now think about that in terms of your own life. When God requires of you to do things, but I'm tired, but I'm exhausted. And do you know what the worst part is? Is that these people are not appreciative. Right? They're not getting the teaching. They're not getting the ministry. They're there for the show. Well, actually, as I put it down, bread, circuses, and free health care. That's what they're there for. That's what they want. They want to be entertained. Wow, look at the miracles. Look at the healings. They want to be fed. Wow, food. And they want the free health care. They want to be healed. That's what they're there for. And even though Jesus knows that they're unappreciative, even though he knows why they're there, he still takes care of them. They're taking advantage of him, and he knows it. And he still takes care of them. Do we have that attitude? I'm tired. I don't want to serve. It's been a long day. It's been a long week. The kids have been yanging. I don't want to serve. I'm just going to sit back. I'm going to relax. I need to go on a retreat. That's what I need. I need to go to a desolate place and just commune with nature. And if somebody shows up, I am going to bite their head off because they're bugging me. I'm tired here. I have an excuse of why I can get angry. Yes, you like the crowds. But you will like the crowds when they're not making demands on you personally. Right? Luncheons. Oh my goodness, did I say luncheons? Luncheons. There is a setup and a cleanup and a feeding of the 5,000. Right? Sometimes it does. Sometimes it sounds like 5,000 down there. But it's exhausting work. And we often don't have the attitude of Christ. Humility, considering others better than ourselves, right? Self-sacrificial love. And Jesus isn't just tired. He's mourning the death of his cousin, and yet he has compassion on them and still serves. It's challenging. It was challenging for me when I was reading this and studying this to think about that. That this wasn't just, they would just happen to be walking along and there was this crowd and they fed them and they took care of them and then it was done. No, they are coming at this originally from the point they're already exhausted. They're already tired. And then they have to do all this. And it is not just like that to take care of, to feed, distribute food for 20,000 people. So then they gather up the food, the fragments, and they get the leftovers. So not only do they not get fresh food, they get the leftovers afterwards to eat. And then Jesus dismisses the crowds and sends them away, it says in the Synoptics. So in the Synoptics, it almost sounds like it's all a nice, peaceful kind of, Jesus sends the disciples away, and then he gives a benediction and a little closing argument, and then the crowds all disperse. There's a more imperative sense given in John. They want to come and make him king by force. They are absolutely thrilled that he has given them food to eat and has healed the sick, and they want to keep this gravy train going, so they want to make him king. Jesus sends away the disciples. and then he removes himself from the crowd. One of the things that I thought was interesting, though, was that what happens right after this? Anybody read on or know? Where did the disciples go? Yes, Hendrik?
Well, they go to the other side.
Well, not immediately. They don't get there.
Plus they go in the boat.
They go in the boat, and they go out, and what happens to them? There's a big storm. Think about that. Jesus just dismissed the crowds, but then you get a huge storm. So there ain't no hanging around. There's a storm comes up. It's dark, and there's a storm. And he goes off by himself. So this is kind of it's done, kids. We're done here. It's not, everybody goes and it's nice and the stars are out and it's a beautiful evening and you can go for a stroll. It's not like that. The disciples go out and we're going to see that they are hard pressed when they row. So much so that they make almost no headway. It is brutal if you've ever been. We'll talk about that later. If you've ever been canoeing or kayaking on the river, when the storm comes up, you don't get nowhere. And that's what it is for them. And so there is this sort of finality here that is given that Jesus has dismissed the crowds who were going to make him king. And it's done. He's done. They're done. It's all over. This passage is a setup passage. Just like the healing of the man by the pool in Bethesda, this healing is a setup for the dialogue that's going to happen on the other side of the lake. Because it's incredibly important that you understand that these people were there for bread, circuses, and free health care because they were focused on this kingdom. They wanted a kingdom of Israel that was going to overthrow the Romans, and they were going to live in the lap of luxury and be the top of the hill. And Jesus is going to explain to them some pretty hard truths. These people, this is the zenith of Jesus' popularity. This is the cap to his popularity. He don't get no more popular than this. 1 year from now, these very people that are going to make him king are going to be crying out, crucify him, crucify him. In 1 year. That's how quickly his popularity plummets. And so we need to remember that. We're pretty much done. I have one more point, but I don't see it. So I guess we're not going to get to that one. We'll do it in the recap next week. Anyways, so we see that the disciples have served with Christ and have labored with him, that Jesus has labored in spite of the fact that these people are unappreciative. That also is one of the things that we should remember in ministry, is that not only is it a self-sacrifice, but it's often a self-sacrifice for people who really don't. How many times have you said, those people don't even appreciate what I do? Right? You're right. They might not. That's not the point. The point is not the worthiness of the object of your ministry. That's important to remember. It is the ministry itself as an offering to God. Jesus was doing the will of his Father, the work of his Father that was preset for him to do. We are to do those works which were set up beforehand that we should walk in them. Remember, in the end times, because of the increase in lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. Because of the increase in the unworthiness of the people and the difficulty in the ministry, the love of many will grow cold. It is already becoming increasingly difficult for us to do the good works that we have set before us to do. Okay, we're done.